What's up, everybody? This is Gabby Staten Island on the Craft Growers Network. And of course, we're joined by my co hosts Cosmic and Sasha, the Slovenian Hobbit. And today, our guest is JJ Edwards from Dawg Seeds. We've done a few episodes regarding the sour, including with Klopp. And it was definitely something that was high on my list is to have a conversation with JJ because he was extremely relevant to the sour story. As a matter of fact, far more relevant than I am. You know, people generally or regularly say, "Hey, Gabby, I want to thank you for your involvement in the sour," and I tell them I really had nothing to do with it. I mean, I was living on the West Coast, and we got the sour cuts out here, and I've grown a lot of sour, more sour than most people, I think. But JJ was in the heart of the sour scene in New York. He used to do business with Klopp, and so really nice to have you finally, JJ, and tell us your weed story.
No, yeah, I appreciate it, and I don't deserve all those accolades. I was so,
Well, I didn't say you were cool or anything. I just said you were relevant.
um, I was lucky enough to be, in the right place at the right time, and and really a lot of those accolades go to some of the other people that created the sour diesel, like Klopp was part of it. And AJ had a big part of the distribution and getting the popularity out there. So, I was just one of those people that were kind of along for the ride. But just I guess starting from the beginning. I started first. I first smoked weed when I was 13, and I think that was like in 1979, and it was, I think it was it was a snowy Christmas day actually, and we used to go out shoveling snow to make money, and me and my neighbor. And so it had snowed. We, got our shovels. We went out. We were gonna shovel some driveways and sidewalks, and he pulled out a joint. He had some older brothers, and I guess he had gotten a joint from them, and we were in the woods and we smoked it. And that was basically, my first experience with it. Now, I was probably in seventh grade at the time. And growing up in middle school, I probably, had a couple more experiences with weed, but it wasn't really a regular thing for me until I hit high school. And, when we hit high school, it was kind of turned into an everyday thing. There was people smoking. There were people selling loose joints for $1 back then, if you could believe that. The people used to just take a Marlboro box, fill it up with joints, bring it, into, the school in the beginning of school, and you would be able, we had a smoking section on grounds, and so everyone would smoke their cigarettes, and we smoked our weed there too. So that's where pretty much going up through high school, I when you're smoking and buying weed, you're actually starting to sell it to your friends and stuff. So like unknowingly, you kind of just start into the business if you're buying it, and your friend is like, "Oh, sell me some, $5 or $10 worth," or and then before you know it, you're kind of wheeling and dealing a little bit, trying to make free weed basically back then, and so, that was really my first experiences, really, coming up through high school, experiencing kind of the late 70s, early 80s. Well, I would describe the late 70s as kind of the Cheech and Chong era, and it kind of was kind of the Panama Reds, the Acapulco Golds, the Colombian Golds. All,
And you were getting that as a kid?
um, I no, I had gotten the Colombian Gold one time, and it was this really bright gold, kind of sativa-y. it was kind of grassy the way that it looked almost, but it wasn't really loose, but it was kind of loose, but not super loose. But and my friend's brother who was older, we split an ounce and we got a half ounce each of it. And at the time he didn't say it was gold or anything like that, but I was like, man, I've never seen weed like this before. And then looking at pictures of the real stuff, I recognized it right away. And so I was really too young to really like remember. It was probably more sativa uppity high. I don't remember it really being that devastating or anything like that, but I was probably too young to really recognize the effects and the specialness of it. And so we used to get some good Thai back then, the Hawaiian, but really, leading up until, I would say 81, 82, everything was strictly import. So we would always just see the Mexicans and the Colombians and
Jamaican.
Jamaicans basically, and the Thais would, rarely come in. But then there was, that's when the real Sensi bud came out, and we called it the Christmas tree bud, and it was just the green Sensi bud that came out of Cali. I guess it was pretty much outdoor light depth. Looking back at it, had a little bit of a sativa twist to it, very piney and stuff. So that was pretty much like the first kind bud, if you want to call it that, that I experienced. Other than the Hawaiian bud would come in, and I remember that. Well, both of them were back then was $200 an ounce, and so we're talking early '80s, and compared to like you can get an ounce of Mexican or so for $40 or $30. So that was, it was quite a big difference in price. So, yeah, that was really kind of my first experience in the kind bud, and as I graduated high school and such, and so people started going into New York City and scoring weed. And so that's, I started, a friend of mine introduced me to someone he had hooked up with, and, I got an in right away. And so we would be able to go there and get 1,200 pounds, $1,200 pounds of pretty much really good green Mexi mids that were kind of we call them the pillows, because they would you would be able to break one up and fill up a whole gallon baggie, and so that would be your pillow pretty much. And so we would get those and bring them back to Jersey, and so that was really my first. Then I was able to tap into the local scene of the exotics of the stuff that they were bringing in, and so I was able to see a lot of different stuff. In the mid to late or 80s yeah, because I pretty much probably started going in the city around 85, and so from 85 going onwards. I was just had a plug in the city. He had an apartment, and you could just go up and cherry pick what you wanted, what he had for sale. And then I wound up in the park in 1991,
Sheep's
Sheep's
Meadow.
Meadow. But it was 92. I first went up there in 91. I scoped out the scene, and I seen it was just an open air drug market, kind of like, the same thing that you were doing in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park. And there was a connection between Sheep Meadow and Golden Gate Park, because a lot of the hippies that they would just travel back and forth, to both places. And, people would mention to me Golden Gate Park. That's where, you go and you'd be able to buy acid and buy weed and mushrooms and psychedelics. And it was the same scene in Sheep's Meadow, when I first went in there. And so when I went,
Sheep's Meadow was a really cool
yeah,
place. Like particularly in when the weather was nice, Sheep's Meadow was just like a magical place where not, because, the Golden Gate Park over by the Haight Ashbury, it was really kind of a seedy scene. It was
it
dark
was, well,
and
Sheep's Meadow
seedy.
was dark too. If you, I mean,
But what I was gonna say is in the summertime,
even
Sheep's Meadow would be,
it would
would be
fill up.
really, there'd be families there too,
Yes,
and
but in the midst of all of that, someone would pull out a gun, or
yeah.
I saw it firsthand. You know what I mean?
I got robbed there too, but it wasn't in the
Yeah,
summertime.
no,
It
I've
was more like,
seen. Well,
later
I
in the
mean,
season.
as it got more packed, it got more dangerous because it was hard to see like what was going on at the time. I saw some kid trying to. Well, I watched a scammer. He used to sell fake hits. And the guy was kind of big. He had just gotten out of jail months beforehand, and I was aware who he was. And he was trying to, there's like this young, like 17-year-old high school kid was trying to buy some hits from him, and they were fake. And the kid was looking at him, and then he was like unsure. And then he had the money in his hand, and then eventually the fucking dude just fucking yoked him around and fucking tried choking him out and grabbing his money. And this was like just in the same environment as you described, families, kids, like it was just crazy back then. So like, it was, even though, there would be people like JFK Jr. up there, all types of actors, celebrities, it was really a really cool scene back then. But as I before that, so I first got in there in '91. I started, I saw the scene. I prepared myself for, during the winter, because during the winter that's when all the good weed would come in. So like some of these really good like high end Mexis came in, and they were like, it was kind of like the Pretendica weed back in the day, if you remember the Pretendica, and that was like really good Mexi, and there was like maybe a few seeds in there. So if you were really slick, you were able to pop those seeds out and present it almost as kind bud. So I had gotten some of that, and
That was the first fakers.
right, right. So I saw this, the potential of this. So I was just going to bag up Ace and just sell it straight up, So I got a good price on it, and that's what I did. I hit the park, and I just started selling, Ace of that Mexi out there, and I didn't really have any really straight kind bud connections or grower connections back then. Like I had my main plug, and he would get exotics here and there and whatever. So, but I didn't really have my main connection. And then, one day that all changed. I met Mike Klopp out there, and
The
the
Weasel.
Weasel, yeah. So, I mean, when I met Mike, he had the Skunk 1, 2, and 3. So that was the RFK 1, 2, and 3. So proceeding, that's when you guys, kind of, did, your whole thing with, the RFK, and, how he inspired you to grow, and then you inspired him to grow. And then eventually Mike inspired me to grow. So it was like a really kind of real, full circle kind of a thing. It didn't start off like that, but when I first met Mike, and he was just selling the, RFK 1, 2, and 3. So, I was just, he was a grower, and I was just like, listen, dude, I'll take everything you got, because he had everything broken down into quarters. And he was like, oh, well, I'm going to try to sell all of them. I said, listen, how much do you want for them? And I'll take them all. Boom. And then, so I just wanted to lock him in. And eventually I did, and, the business, he started getting a little bit bigger. Then he was like, hey, listen, maybe we shouldn't meet in the park anymore. We should go down to wetlands. He's like, you go down to wetlands on Tuesday. It's Grateful Dead night. They have a drum circle and stuff. You can smoke weed, blah, blah, blah. And so we went down there, and it was like, it was really cool down there. And so, yeah,
Downstairs in the
yes,
wetlands where they
yes.
had all the pillows and
Yes, yes. Well, they had a Greenpeace meeting before that. So as soon as the Greenpeace meeting wrapped up, everyone would be just sitting there hanging out with a guitar, some bongos, a tambourine, whatever little instrument you had, and so, uh, once the Greenpeace meeting wrapped up, then everyone would just start jamming a little bit, getting the scene going. They would start playing some, dead music. Some nights you had a cover band. So it was a really, really cool scene back then. And so, that's how we kind of first met AJ. And so, like, somehow or another, he just kind of sniffed us out because it was just me meeting Mike down there, And so, we would do the deal, and then we would be able to spark up and kind of relax, and you know what I mean. And so that's when we first met AJ, and he sniffed out, the I think by then he might have gotten the chem dog by then. And so that's yeah, pretty much that. He had the chem 91 back then.
you mean the weasel,
The
right?
we
Not AJ.
No, not AJ. The Weasel had it, and so he sniffed out the 91 that me and him were smoking, and then he just kind of he's like, hey, if you want, we can go into the back office because he was an intern for the Greenpeace meeting and also for the bar and stuff. So, he had the back office. So we used to be able to go right into the back office, and have like 4 or 6 people there, break out all of our weed, just kind of start throwing down, smoking, selling this and that. And yeah, that's how that whole thing really kind of first started. And that's when, that's when diesel first got coined because he'd be like, yo, you guys got any of that diesel? Meaning the 91, but meaning like back then, diesel was kind of just a catch name for stuff that was really strong. So like a lot of things were diesel back then, so it wasn't just weeds. So, that's kind of where the first called diesel. And then, I remember smoking a J with someone down there, and I passed it to him, and he's smoking on it. He's like, is this organic? And I'm like, no, I don't think. At the time I wasn't growing. I didn't know. I was like, no, I don't think so. He goes, what's the name of this stuff? I was like, it's called Chem Dog. He's like, Chem. He's grown with chemicals, this and that. And he's just like, because of the smell and everything. Then he just started going off on his tangent. So then after that, I was like, oh wow, maybe we should just start, get rid of the chem and just kind of call it diesel or, so that's kind of the direction it kind of went in the beginning with the 91 was kind of
I had a similar feeling and story myself. I don't know if you've heard it on my podcast, but when I got the Chem Dog from Greg, I was an organic grower. And I was like, I'm not going to call this shit the Chem Dog. Like, I'm growing it organic. So I just used to call it the dog, because for me, at that point, I was offended by the idea of growing with mineral salts, which, I've come a long way since then. But yeah, I just called it the dog, not the Chem Dog.
yeah there
So, and back then, it wasn't called the 91, you know. It was just the Chem Dog
right.
at the time.
Yeah, but back then there was just like this whole kind of hippy dippy kind of organic kind of thing going on back then, and no one really had the real knowledge behind all of it. especially back then, everyone was just kind of trying to work with guanos and other kind of stuff like that. And so, that just stuff just really turned into a nightmare in the end. So it was just so much work, and it was still really hard to pull off. So, you know, especially if you're growing for production. So you just got to really start making some decisions on really what you're doing. But back then, none of that was really thought of. It was just a matter of a lot of people just had grows in their closet or their bedrooms, or one or two lights, and that's really how it started. People didn't start out with these big elaborate 5 or 10 light grows. They were happy just to pull one or two lights off, because we didn't know what the fuck we were doing back then. It was really
And also, we were getting such a high price that with two lights, we were making a great living.
right, right. You're right about
It's
that.
funny when you think about saying, 2 to 5 lights as an elaborate grow, but back then it was.
Yeah, no, you're
If you had 5 lights back then, you were just
right,
crushing.
but
You were making so much
yeah,
money.
but if you're getting, 400 or 500 an ounce straight up, like, and you can't grow enough of it, like, and that's kind of like how it was, because really there weren't really that many people that were really growing back then, and growing, the super fire stuff, on top of it, so there were people who were growing, but when people smelled the Chem Dog, when they smelled the sour diesel, it was something like they've never seen before, and people just started going crazy for it. And just, touching on, the sour, it was really, AJ that really kind of, got that popularized down in the city. And, at the time I was just kind of, selling weed, and I was close to the sources of Klopp, who, where those seeds first started off at. And, but even before that, Mike had made the Underdog, which I don't know if you ever remember the Underdog, and it was 91 times well, he's told me two different stories on it. Originally, when I first remember him telling me, he told me it was NL Super Skunk times the 91. Now he says it was just the NL times the 91. But after after growing it and smoking it, like, there was definitely some skunk in there, because NLs are kind of blandish, and the 91 you can kind of say the same thing about it, other than the cheminess to it. There is no real funk, like skunkiness, so to speak, to it. Kind of like, I would say the Chem D is more skunkier than the 91. So
The 91, I think, is more like OG.
yeah, and
People think
really,
of like
and it's
OG.
funny that you say that, because I think the same thing. And if you think about it now, if the story that's true about the OG being, now the guy that tells the story says it was, what did he say it was Hindu Kush times the Emerald Triangle, which we don't know what the Emerald Triangle was, but we do know the Hindu Kush that he had gotten at the time from Neville. Well, that was NL2 times Kush number 4. And I've grown out the NL2 recently from Todd McCormick. And I can tell you, when the growth of the NL2 compared to the 91 and the Kush, they're pretty much the same. The terp profiles are a little bit different, but the popcorn style nugs and the way that it stretches out and everything, and even Neville himself, when he first saw the OG, he said, he's like, yeah, that's my NL2 is in there. So he recognized it. So, I have it might be, different type of mixture, but I would say NL2 is probably in both the Kush and in the 91. And from my experience, from what I've grown out, so it's funny that you mentioned that.
I mean, to me, it's obvious when you taste, and most people, I could say even today, most people have zero experience smoking the Chem Dog, the 91. But when I smoke any OG or the Chem Dog, it's like they're sisters.
Right, I
You can
agree.
definitely taste
Yeah,
that.
but then we don't know what the Emerald Triangle was, so that definitely had some kind of like gassiness. It seems like whatever, but to me the question is where does that chem come from? Where does that chem funk come from? And so that's, to me, I think it's got to be some type of Afghan or Hindu Kush or something along those lines, because you just don't really get that fueliness really out of any kind of like Mexican sativa or anything like that. That has been suggested in the past, so that's the question, is where does that, like, even with the Chem D, you get that garlic oniony kind of thing going on. And and then originally, you had the 91 and the sister. You remember the sister. And the sister was kind of like the sativa version of the Chem D. Like, they both smelled exactly the same, but grew totally different, and the effects were totally different. Where the sister was more of that sativa, kind of more stretchy, more kind of uplifting, kind of, but it still kind of had that garlic, oniony kind of profile that the Chem D has, and the Chem D is more of a more indica, more, heavy hitting type of plant. And so even in there's lots of hybrid sativa indica hybrids even in Afghanistan and Pakistan. As you get up north more, as you're getting towards the Indian borders in Nepal and all that, you start getting into, I think, a little bit more sativa type of plants that could possibly, especially on the more going towards India, I would say, that would maybe, display some of these, traits. But, all that is kind of speculation on my part. And, I don't have any real proof to really, behind any of that. But, at this point, we only kind of have that to go on, is what we know and what the history of certain things are in certain regions and stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of that's been lost because of wars and stuff like that. So, there isn't like, any of us could really go on the ground over there and try to do any kind of research or whatever. But even what Kevin Jodrey did was, you got to have a set of balls to really, go over there. At that point, your life is in these other people's hands. I wouldn't feel safe unless I had an armed security guard with me at all times, because just the appearance of you could just, make someone want to do something possibly. So, I tip my hat to him, to, for having the balls to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I would say you would need more than one armed guard. Or I would want more than one armed guard, because what's one guy with a gun gonna do against,
Right, 10 people
a
with a
bunch of
gun,
people with
yeah.
guns?
So,
Right.
but
So, one question I want to ask, since you've got the dancing bears behind you, when did you get into the Grateful Dead?
my first show was spring of '87 at the Brendan Byrne Arena. Opening song was Dancing in the Streets.
Nice. And you got the dancing bears behind you. My first show was at the same location, but in 1988. Brendan Byrne, 33088 was
I
my
was
first
at
show.
those
And,
shows.
and the reason why I wanted to ask was because, well, first of all, because I'm a deadhead, but second of all was you didn't find Kind Bud at the Grateful Dead shows and weren't able to make any connections for nice weed there. You had to wait, because you're saying you weren't getting any of that till 91,
Well, I was getting
or
it. I
later.
was getting it some from my plug, in the city, but it wasn't like I was directly, connected to the grower or anything. And yeah, when I used to go into the shows, everyone would go shopping park, in the parking lot on Shakedown Street and everything. But I never, when I went to the shows, it really wasn't my focus to do business, really. It was really my focus was more to enjoy myself, let my guard down, and, have a good time and everything. So, when you're high on mushrooms and acid, sometimes it's hard to navigate, doing things. So, uh, yeah, I never really made any really major connections on tour or anything like that. I wouldn't, I wasn't really a tour head. I mean, I would go to most local
The
shows.
local shows.
I would, go out on the East Coast or, we would, plan a trip here or there, but no, I wasn't someone that went on tour on every show or whatever, and so I stayed within my means and my bounds, and at that time I was really just trying to get my shit together and and figure out life, because you're trying to think about doing a career, and then you're hustling on the side, and so you see how much money is kind of being made, and it's a hard decision, and I went the route of going into a trade school and learning a craft in the union, and and trying to have some kind of legitimate skills to be able to survive on, other than kind of hustling and dedicating my life full time to hustling and selling weed, and kind of looking back now how things have kind of shaken out, and some of those people now that kind of went the route of just doing the hustle, now they find themselves in a spot now because of legalization, and things aren't the way they used to, and now they don't have no job skills to survive on the outside. Now you find yourself 60, 65 years old with no job skills. You got minimal money. You might own a house or have some kind of equity behind you, but trying to uh, trying to make money, in that type of, in today's, times and everything, it's really tough. Back in the day, it was easy for anyone to pick up a job. The only thing you had to do is pick up a newspaper and look in the want ads. That doesn't exist anymore, like,
And back in the day in New York City, you could be a terrible grower and still make good
oh,
money.
yeah.
Like you could grow shitty weed, get a shitty yield,
Sell it wet.
and still be sell it wet and still be crushing. Nowadays, you can be growing really good weed and still struggle
Right.
selling it. And struggle selling it for a price where you could actually even just pay the bills to grow it.
Well, now I think it's really it's all about the retail now. So if you're growing, if you got a home grow, and you got to have your own customers, basically. There's no more wholesale. So there's no more, so all the people that you're selling to are all consuming it. Maybe you might get a few people that might take something, but like for the prices, like, and and as a grower, as a craft grower, what is the bottom? What I mean, what's the bottom per pound that you're willing to go? So here,
I don't think we've found out yet.
yeah, to me, I mean, anywhere it ranges. It could be 24 to $3,000. And it really all depends on how good of a grower you are, how good your product is, and where you're willing to stand, and if you're like, listen, my units are 3Gs straight up, and if you're only producing X amount of product and you're able to sell it
before the next crop.
before the next crop, that's what so it's better to have a demand than have an oversaturation. And that's where I think the commercialized legal market has made the mistake, because they've made these massive grows, that cost a lot of money to keep up, just in payroll and just monthly expenses. And just as you explained, like, all right, so it doesn't matter how many square feet you have. If you ain't selling all that weed before your next crop, then it's just a race to the bottom. You know what I mean? So to me, I think it's being better to be micro, being small craft, producing a higher quality product that's going to sell out and be in demand. And then you could build your business model off of that if you want to upscale off of that. But starting off of these big upscale projects just don't work. Just doesn't work.
The majority of them fail.
Yes, and otherwise, well, the majority of them are backdooring pounds out the fucking back, and that's the only way they are
Well,
surviving.
everyone, not the majority, every single
Right.
one.
And they've
Anyone
also,
to, anyone that tells you that they're not backdooring the weed is just, trying to protect their privacy and,
And
but they
so
don't
to
know.
me, if you can do this craft thing and go right from, you know, farmer to consumer, like that's the best business model that there is. There's no middleman. It's from seed to sale. Small craft farmer markets, higher quality, higher profits. Per per unit, should we say now? Overall sales per year, yeah, you may be limited, but listen, if you're just one or two people, or how much money do you need every what I'm saying? Like, you just got to be happy for what you get, and just be thankful that you're doing something that you love and getting paid for it. Like, I like to make it the analogy of comparing it to being in music, where you don't have to be a superstar. You could be a music teacher. And if you can make a living off of teaching people how to play guitar or piano, and you're doing something that you love and you're getting paid for it, like, that's a win for me.
Yeah.
it's also a hard life. I've done that. I had my own teaching company.
Yeah.
I was going to say though, with those commercial growers, one of the other things that they've done is they've essentially flooded the market and they've lowered prices significantly. I'm here in Southern California, and I'm luckily in a position where I have a career. I don't, I do my breeding stuff for fun. I don't have to rely on anything, to help pay the bills. But from what I understand, pounds out here, even for high quality product, it's like 1,800, $2,000, for a pound. And
That's for the best quality product.
exactly. And
And that's hard to get.
I mean, most people, they don't really care too much. They can go to their local dispensary and get ounces for what, 60, 70, $80, and in their mind, that's what the price is now. It doesn't matter if it's craft or if it's commercial, the average person, at least. So
I
definitely
remember,
unfortunate.
it was the early 2000s, or somewhere in the 2000s, when sun-grown in California was dropping below $1,000 a pound, and everyone thought that that was the end. They couldn't believe that they couldn't get $1,000 a pound for their outdoor weed. And today, that same weed is a couple $100. Like, you can get really, really nice outdoor weed, not greenhouse, for $300, $200. And like the best greenhouse weed, maybe not like light assisted, but just greenhouse weed, if you can get $400 or $500 for that, you're absolutely crushing. And I remember some old time growers that thought, $1,000 a pound. Anything less than that was just, how do you survive? And also think about it, that was $1,000 a pound 20 plus years ago. So with the value of money having changed, it's become very difficult to make a living growing weed these days is the reality.
And also, I think it's knowing who your customers are and trying to market yourself towards them, because right now, the market is just flooded with mids. Just flooded. So, as Cosmic was saying, like most people, weed is weed, right? To people like us, weed isn't weed. So, so when you're in the mids game, like you're not really particularly, trying to, overdo things for people as in promotions and stuff. It is what it is, where you're trying to do a more higher connoisseur clientele, then you got to get people's attention. It's like, and so and really, it comes down to the product speaking for itself. When something is that good and it's shown around, and then it gets recognized, and then it becomes its own thing. So you can't really make that up. The only thing you could do is you put something in the market, and the market determines kind of like what it is. And so, when you're dealing with a higher connoisseur type of people that are weed nerds, essentially, that know everything about weed, so that, those are going to be your more craft kind of customer, where, they come in, they're going to want to know, what's behind the lineage of this and that. And, when you're talking to a bud tender and they tell you, well, it's a sativa, that's all I know, it's a sativa, or it's a hybrid, or, whatever. And so I think, knowledge behind the product and the way that, you market yourself and all of that. And, all of that is very relevant in today's, because, kids now, you're on Instagram and you're just kind of scrolling through, and then all of a sudden you see that picture of a bud with diamonds on it, and all of a sudden you stop and look at it and you're like, wow, that looks amazing, and you give it a like, and you might fucking give it a fire comment or something like that, but, and that's kind of like what we're kind of, you know, it's just like driving down the highway and you see a billboard with a bikini girl on it. You're going to take a look at it, and so everything is kind of like, for the moment. And I think, as terps are now become a big part of the equation. It's just not the looks of it. Now you're talking about the smell of things. And so when you open a jar of that old school sour diesel and you just smell it and you just kind of like, all of a sudden all of these other senses get activated in your brain. The smell of the sense of smell is very strong. It's like smelling a woman or smelling something that is enticing. And so, I kind of, compare cannabis the same way, because when you crack that jar and you smell that, and that's the first thing, how you judge things is by the smell. And now you look at it and it smells amazing and it looks amazing. So that must mean that it must be amazing, And as we all know, that's not always the case, Trying to get something to check all the boxes is very rare. There are, a lot of things that do fit that description, but that's kind of like, where I think, the future is. It's just, it's an ever-changing market. Even when you're judging something, if you're in a contest or whatever, I could speak from my past experience as being a judge. Once you smoke like the fifth or tenth thing, the effect is non-existent. So if you're judging now, what are you judging? You're not judging by effect anymore. Now you're judging by the way that it smells and the way that it looks. So
Not So Dog mentioned something similar in one of his podcasts as far as the Ego Clash, which is a hash competition here in California. And he said, you're judging so much hash in such a short period of time that, after the first couple of dabs,
no, that's it.
there's really no way to do it. Now, the Emerald Cup is a little bit better because they give the judges like judging packs, and they have them for over a month, so they have time to go through it and be a little bit more conscious of the effect. But even with that, they have so many entries that they're going through that it's pretty hard to judge the high.
No, it is.
Yeah, so I I wanted to. We talked about Klopp and the sour story a little bit, but I wanted to get back to that just a little because I feel like we glossed over it, and the sour is something that not only a lot of people want to know about, but it's also a big part of the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts about the sour. I was there, buying weed from Klopp the whole time. And so, what we do know is that, seeds were found in a bag of 91 that Klopp sold to Vondo. And Vondo lived upstate with a guy named Maxwell. And they both lived together, and they sprouted those seeds that they found from Klopp that became the Diesel number 1 and 2. And recently, Maxwell went on a different podcast, and he kind of elaborated on, he came, because Maxwell was, he had dropped out of the scene. He had started a family, and just really got back on the internet within the past couple of years. And so AJ went on a podcast with him, and they kind of confirmed a few things I didn't know really at the time. But so those guys were both living together, had the Diesel 1 and 2. They were growing that, but also they had in their room the RFK, I guess that Klopp gave them, and they also had a purple Kush seed that they had gotten from Kyle Cushman. And I've talked to Maxwell, and we've kind of bounced back and forth some different ideas. But we do know that those 4 plants were in the room: Diesel 1, Diesel 2, RFK, Purple Kush. One of those plants hermied. Well, we do know that the RFK had a very strong reputation of herming, and that was one of the reasons why Klopp got rid of it. Especially if you didn't clip off the lower branches, it usually would throw a herm or two. So, that to me, that probably would be one of the strongest candidates to that would have hermed in the room, and it pollinated. I don't know if it was the Diesel 1 or the Diesel 2. They grew out that stuff and sold that weed to a guy named Manny, and Manny found the seeds and grew them out that really became the sour Diesel. And so we know that I know I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that Vondo went out to California, and I don't know if he had the Diesel 1 or Diesel 2 clone, or he had gotten seeds from Manny, but there seems to be some kind of connection. I guess Vondo,
When was that?
Well, it had to be Vondo. I think that he left for California in '94.
And are you saying that he did got those seeds before then?
Well, all those guys were friends, and they were part of the Schenectady, Albany crew. So,
Because
so
to give you a little information, when Vondo came out to California, he had
he had
nothing
nothing.
and didn't know how to grow. And I know this because I gave him everything and taught him how to grow. I was partners with him. So he didn't come out with the sour or the 91, or he didn't have any of that stuff.
Yeah, you'd have to clarify that with him. But I heard that there was a rumor that he might have had brought in seeds out there. I don't know if that was true or not. You'd have to ask him. And really, the real players in the whole sour story is really, Vondo, Maxwell, and Manny. At the end of the day, those three guys, AJ, myself, and other people were kind of involved afterwards. AJ more than me. I know that Manny, he was connected to the bro, Keith in Albany. So that was, that connection with the bro. The bro brought sour clones out to Amsterdam at some point in the '90s, I guess through Manny. So really, these guys are still around, and you can really, if you can get Maxwell on and Vondo on and Manny on, those guys are the ones that really know these really intricate details. A lot of stuff you hear through different channels through the years, and yeah, the story changes because a guy like Maxwell comes out after 25 years and tells his side of the story, where Vondo, he's been around, but he's never really told really kind of like, what happened in the room, or what strains they had in the room. And, there was no really specific details behind any of that until Maxwell came out. So, as time goes on, these guys may be willing to talk to find out the details of everything else. But as far as I know, this is as much as we know as of right now.
Well, I just looked up in my phone and I still have Vondo's phone number, so
Yeah,
I can give him a call.
yeah.
I don't know
Well, yeah, you
Maxwell,
might. Well,
but
you can contact. He's Wild Mountain Cannabis. Wild Mountain
on
Cannabis
Instagram.
on Instagram. But also, you can probably get through to him through AJ, because I think both of them are working on seed projects together. So, Wild Mountain Cannabis and AJ Sauer, those guys definitely, they did another podcast and they had elaborated on some of this stuff. So that was how I became aware of it. But but then I got into a conversation with Maxwell, and we just I was kind of curious about it myself, so there was definitely some more to dig into.
Yeah, I feel like it's the topic that we will never completely get dug into.
And everyone is kind of like, on the search for the real sour, and what happened to the sour. Is it real? Is it fake? Like, so like originally there was only one cut of the sour, which was originally known as the AJ sour, because AJ was the one that brought it down to the city, and he was the one that started selling trays of it. And then he was setting up other people like Wing Wang. He was setting up other rooms, and he was getting pieces of the room. So it was in his interest to spread the sour around, because there was never enough of it, and so like you could literally just have, well, no one could produce that much, because most people were only running like 5 lights, maybe 10 lights. Back then was a really big grow. So like most people didn't have 10 lights, like the most I ever had was 8, and so, back then, things were scary back then. The bigger that you got, the more, the more of a chance something could happen. And it all depending on the logistics of where you were, the grow, the building, your neighbors.
We were doing it all in homes.
Yes,
We weren't ever doing it in
yes,
commercial
no, you're
buildings,
right.
so we always had power
Yes,
limitations
power
as well.
limitations, and you had neighbors to worry about,
The
landlords to
smell.
deal with. So there was always,
Carrying bales of Pro Mix in.
everything, just, getting garbage out the door, getting stuff up into, just back and forth, carrying garbage bags at nighttime, filling up a Suburban parked out front, and just speeding off and dumping the garbage, who knows where, but yeah, it was different back then. It was,
I I made a video. I'm not sure if you saw it. It was one of the first videos that I made, and I tell a story about how I lived on the third story in Brooklyn
oh
for
yes.
my first growth. Did
Yes,
you
I
hear that
did. That's
story?
that's
I
insane.
I flushed all my soil and all my garbage trash down the toilet.
That's insane.
I was I was petrified to put it on the street. That's how the cops would find out.
Yeah.
Like they were going through people's
Yeah,
garbage if
but
they had
we,
any
what we
suspicions.
did was we would just get like those big contractor garbage bags, and so you're just hauling the bags in and out of the building. You just fill up the trunk of your car and speed off. And back then there wasn't cameras or anything around, so you could just pull up to really any kind of industrial or commercial place and find a dumpster or wherever you could find some garbage cans or throw it off on the curb somewhere where it's going to get picked up or. You can't really get away with that kind of stuff now with cameras everywhere. But back then, yeah, you didn't want to have any kind of paraphernalia or anything in your garbage, empty fertilizer bottles or anything of that stuff. You didn't want, you wanted to try to keep everything as clean and as quiet as possible.
I
Yeah.
found someone's dump like that one time. I was working for an office furniture company, and they had a dumpster in the back. I went down to go break down some boxes, and I just started smelling. I was like, "What the hell?" So I opened it up, and sure enough, there was these garbage bags full of like premature plants that for whatever reason they cut them down. But yeah, it's so funny that you brought that up.
Yeah, and that's what you had to do back in the day. It's, it's
The people that didn't do that ended up getting locked up.
Yeah. And also, you didn't want to tell anyone. Like you were kind of like a hermit in a sense where you didn't have people coming over to your house. The only people that came over to your house were the essential people that knew that what you were doing and maybe helped you out for watering when you're out of town or some kind of maintenance or help, maybe helped you trim or help solve a problem in your room or whatever. You always had to have those kind of people around, but outside of that, like there was no one. It wasn't like yeah, let's come over to my house and let me show you my plants. Like you didn't want to tell anyone anything. So you know uh, being anonymous was the key.
Yeah, for sure. I tell another story about how when I was already in California, a friend knocked on my door one day,
Oh yeah, that's the
unannounced. He
worst.
he he didn't know I was
Oh
growing,
yeah.
and this is
You're
before
peeping
cell
out
phones.
windows, looking to see who is it, and then all of a sudden you got to get enough fucking balls to open up the door to see who it is, and it's your friend. You're expecting
I
like,
was so fucking pissed, and he had no idea why, because he didn't know I was growing. He had been to my house before, but when he came to my house, there was nothing out, and he stopped by my house, and he's like, "Oh, I was just in the neighbor." I was like, "Dude, don't ever fucking come to my house without calling me first." I like, and if anything, that was a big tell. Like,
right,
why
right,
is Gabby so freaked out that I fucking just stopped by to say hello? You
yeah.
know?
But
I feel like
Paranoia.
I
yeah,
feel like nothing's changed, because if someone stops by without hitting you up, you're just like, what the hell? Like, who's at my door?
Oh,
yeah.
I have kids, so my doorbell rings all the time, like my neighbors' kids are always knocking on the door wanting to find my kids and stuff. So
No,
if I freaked out on them, it wouldn't be good.
yeah. I mean, I remember I was up at my house, upstate in the Catskills, and I'm talking about a secluded place where you don't even get cell service. You know what I mean? Like, so all of a sudden I get a knock at the door. I'm like, oh my God, who is it? I'm fucking peeking out the window. I'm like, don't answer the door. Don't answer the door. They leave a note there. It's a census. I didn't send in my census form. And so the census people were up there knocking on my door. But something as stupid as that became like a fucking major fucking, anxiety attack. And even, up until today, I have PSTD, I have, dreams of, the cops coming for me and running from the cops. And, if you've been busted, and I've been busted multiple times, 8 times, 2 felonies, but luckily all that stuff has now been, it's all been cleaned off,
Expunged.
yes, because of legalization. But when you've gone through that trauma of being locked up, having the cuffs on you, spending a day or two in jail, like it really does something to your psyche that you never really recover from, and so yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, for sure. People don't realize the mecca that the Catskills is for cannabis and has been for a long time. You know,
Yeah, it has been. Well, it's a place where you're kind of secluded and everyone kind of minds their own business, and you can kind of come and go unnoticed. Like, I lived at the end of a cul-de-sac. I was the only house on the cul-de-sac. I mean, there was one other house on my street. Like, it was very, very secluded. But I picked that location for a reason, and I was up there for like 12 years, and I never had a problem until one day. I was cutting, and what happened was my septic, the pipe got crushed outside the septic, and so it backed up. So I couldn't take a shower, and stuff. So I was cutting, and when I was driving home, down in 287, I got pulled over by the state cops, and it became this whole ordeal where I had a fertilizer bottle in the trunk, and I just it was one red flag after another. I just saw the whole thing, envisioning the whole thing going down, because really the New Jersey state cops couldn't do anything to me other than arrest me for the pipe I had and a gram or two of weed I had, and then charged me with DWI. But they were very fucking curious about, growing in the fertilizer bottle and such. And so, like, everything was in my name in the power department. The power was in my name. Everything was in my name. So I could just envisioning the New Jersey State Police calling the New York State Police and say, hey, listen, we got this guy coming downstate, run his name. So they run my name, they get the power. They look at the power bill, they see, and I remember because I was getting, I'd get my power bill, and they would give you a rating on how much power you were using, and they would be like, you are number 100 out of 100 out of the most used most used power in the area or some shit like that. And I remember showing my friend, I'm like, look at this, and so so I envisioned them calling, the New York State Police. The only thing they got to do is run the power record. Look at the power record. Oh, it looks pretty high. Okay, so we're gonna go up and do a walk around, and that's what they would essentially would have done. They would have came up to the property,
Look in the trash.
looked in. Well, there was never any trash because I brought all my trash downstate. Like there was no garbage collection there. So everything I brought out, and but they would what they would do is they would walk around the house to see if there was any tell signs of a grow, any smell, anything that would tip them off to be able to try to get a warrant. And then the next thing they would do is try to make contact, try to find out when you were there, try to talk to you just to get you to open the door and such. And you know, and just anything to tip them off so they can get a warrant. So I just, you know, I envisioning all of this happening, and I was just like starting to, you know, get popular with the seeds and everything, and I was like, yo, this is not going to go down like this. And so I just pulled the plug, you know, I shut the room down. I chopped you know, once I had chopped at that time, and I took everything out of the house, because it was drying, and I was like, man, they might fucking come at any time. So I was paranoid, so I fucking I had to bring all the wet weed down to the city and dried it down there and bagged it up. Then I had to get rid of the garbage, and then I had to break down the room. And so the whole thing was like a fucking mad scramble within like a
And
couple.
then they never came?
I don't know if they ever came. They might. I don't know. You know, but my main thing was just fucking pulling the plug and and ending the project because I had already been up there like 10 or like 12 years. So I mean, that's a good run in one fucking spot, you know. So I was like, I ain't gonna press my luck to see what's gonna happen next. I'm just gonna fucking bail out now. So, and you know, and that's what I did. I shut it down. I sold the house, and then I decided to come to Colorado, where I could, you know, grow legally and not have to worry about getting arrested. And I just wanted to make seeds at that point. So, you know, and so that's really, you know, how I really wound up in Colorado was just that.
And is that where you're at still?
Yeah. But now I want to go back
Because
to,
I see sometimes you're in New York
yeah,
City for like,
yes,
you know,
yes, I
contests and
want to go
stuff.
back to New York, but my wife doesn't want to go back. So, but now, I mean, when I came out to Colorado, Colorado was the mecca of the industry, of the cannabis scene. Like, you know, they had just gone rec, the first rec state. Like, that was in 2015. And, you know, now as, you know, other states opened up, people used their experience to go to, you know, different states. And, you know, so really like everyone that was here that made, you know, kind of the Mecca, it's all gone now. There is no more scene here in Colorado anymore. So now that scene exists in New York now. And so, and I don't really see it ever really going away there because New York is a very unique, you know, thing in itself because you're dealing with a mass population of people, with the majority of them having the money that they have to get whatever they want, you know, meaning like, you know, some of these super rich people, you know, they just don't want the best. They want the best of everything. And that was really how the sour diesel kind of fit into the whole equation of the New York scene, was because it was like the quintessential, the creme de la creme of cannabis at the time. And so, you know, just like everything else in life, people want the best. And when they have the money, they're willing to pay for it. And you know, and that's all that they want. They just want results. They don't want anything else but results. So when you deliver that, then you can charge 800 or $1,000 an ounce, as AJ did and other people did. And because that's, you know, people wanted their stuff, they would prepay for it. And, you know, that's how it went down back then. It just was not enough supply back then. So, um, you know, you're dealing with a whole different type of customer out there. And it still exists today to where, you know, we're doing these pop-up events, and it's just people, you know, it's basically people that got, you know, two, three, four, five lights. And, you know, we all come together and, you know, we have these pop-up events, and people could come and they can go from table to table and they could look for the best sour diesel or the best kush or whatever they're looking for, and they, or they might like a specific grower or whatever, and so it gives the consumer an opportunity to get a higher product, and it gives the farmers an opportunity to move their product straight to consumer. And so,
And is this safe?
and it's safe, yes,
It's not legal,
it's
right?
not legal, no. And so, and I think, that model is going to continue to exist because I don't think that the New York market is going to um, be able to compete with the product. Like, I mean, there might be some few, but like anyone that's mass producing any of these, the only people that are going to be able to compete with that are the micro grows. That's it. If you're one of these guys that got,
Or people that have a brand
well,
that people
that's
really
part.
want.
Well, see, that's the thing where the New York market is. If you're a rec grower, like you can't, like you got to sell your guy to a distributor, and then the distributor. I don't know who brands it, if it's the distributor or the dispensary. So like essentially like you'd have to, it doesn't matter what your flower brand is as a grower, if they're not going to brand your flower as such, they can brand it any way they want to. So you can't brand your own weed there, And
Wow.
really, essentially, what happens is all the power now becomes of the broker, because the broker is the one that's gonna that is the middleman between the farmer and the dispensary. So you got to sell to the broker, and the broker can be like, "Well, I'm only going to give you so much for it," or and then he can turn around on the other side. It doesn't matter what on the retail side of it, it doesn't matter what they pay for it. They're just gonna charge double. So that's pretty much how retail works. So as a dispensary, you're gonna buy a wholesale pound and just double it at the minimum. At the minimum, you're gonna double your money on that. So as those guys are going to be making just as much as the farmer, so to speak. Of course they got to move the product, and everyone's got to deal with overhead prices and everything. But as the market shakes out, it always seems even in regular agriculture that the farmer always gets the short end of the stick, and he's the one that's producing the product. And so I
Yeah,
think
for
that's
sure.
a tragedy, especially in cannabis and really in any kind of agriculture, because if you're putting in the hard work, you should be able to at least have the opportunity to sell to the consumer. Now, in some instances, some people might not be geared to sell to the consumer and they only want to sell wholesale. But, as a micro craft farmer, that's what you want, and that's where I think it's going to be profitable.
One question or one topic that we've brought up here a number of times in the podcast, and I'd like to hear what you think is how do you define a craft grower?
That's a hard question, and so I guess at the end of the day, it would be like the product. I mean, the quality of your product, right? you know and then I guess then you can break it down to how many lights, and then you could break it down to is it organic, and then you could just keep breaking it down more and more, I guess to where what your definition of craft is. But like to me, craft is more small scaled, should we say. Now what that number of lights or what that square footage is hard to say. So because even in a black market grow, is it 10 lights, is it 20 lights, like what where is it, where it is it's too much for one
But
person.
now, if you have two lights and it's crap,
you're not
It's not.
craft.
It's,
Right.
right. You're not craft
So
now. And if you have 100 lights and it's fire, is that craft?
yeah, you can consider that, but that is a lot of, to pull that off. Now, I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it's a lot of work, and the guy with 2 lights can give his X amount of plants way more attention than the person with 100 lights. Now, if you got,
Well, if the guy with 100 lights has 50
yeah, I was just gonna
employees,
say now, if he's got like you know, that many employees, but there's a balance of a business of the business part of it where expenses take over. You know what I'm saying? So it doesn't. It's a very fine balance of trying to find that craft mark. I don't know what it is. And in theory, you would think the smaller the better, the easier. Now, if once you get that model down, can you upscale that model into something bigger? That's the question now. Is it 100 lights, all right? Or is that 10 rooms with 10 lights? Or is that 20 rooms with 5 lights? Like, is that possible? You know? So, you know, I think, there's a lot to be, discovered in all that because most people that are going to do 100 lights just got one room with 100 lights. They don't have 10 rooms with 10 lights because now they got to have 10 air conditioning units, 10 uh,
the
dehumidifiers,
power.
10 more of everything, you know. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the cost of things where people, and I've seen this over and over again, where they get, X amount of $1 million, they build out a grow, and then they find out the grow rooms aren't designed properly. And they're like, well, we spent $10 million. Well, you guess what? You got to spend another 2 million to rectify, the engineering defects in there. And so that's, a part of the problem where you got people that are in cannabis that necessarily don't belong in cannabis. They don't come from the culture. They come from a business background and they see everything in dollars and cents, which, let's face it, to run a successful business, you have to have a sense of that, but you also got to have a sense of a long-term plan in sight of experience on exactly how you're going to do things. And so when you get a guy that is, you get some guy that's a real estate guy that got a legal license, and he's got $10 million, and he now all of a sudden he you know employs one of these consultants, and he don't know what the fuck he's doing, and it's just a downhill effect all the way down of people of incompetency that are designing and building and setting up businesses that they have no idea of how it really works. Because in theory, you could have X amount of plants that's gonna produce X amount of pounds, and you're going to get X amount per pound, and on paper, it's all at work, you're going to be fucking super profitable. But at the end of the day, when you fail your testing, you can't get your product out the door, or you get your product out the door and it's worth half of what you thought it was going to be. And so, and when you got these big investments and, investors, to answer to, and things aren't running like they're supposed to, that it just doesn't work, but on paper, it really does work, but at the end of the day, you got to sell all your shit, you know what I mean? And if you can't sell it, what's it worth? It's only worth what people are willing to give you.
Yeah, for sure. my opinion on what a craft grower is has been evolving and still trying to figure it out. So I appreciate you giving your feedback on that. I remember when I asked Kevin what he thought because originally my thought was, look, if you grow this with love and with the intention of growing the highest quality product, to me that's
That's
craft.
if that's
That
if it comes out like that. Just because
But
your
yeah, so what
intentions,
Kevin said,
just because you have those
yeah,
intentions, don't mean the results are going to be that. So,
that's what Kevin said. Kevin said the road to hell was built with good intention. So it's exactly that. But one thing about size is that I believe that some of the larger facilities, they also have they've built nicer grow rooms with more control, with, monitoring that small growers don't have. So I don't think that size is really what decides if it's craft. I mean, in the end, it's the quality that comes out. If the quality is really good, then I think that can be called craft cannabis, no matter what the size of the garden is. I'm a member of a group on Reddit, and it's called Craft Marijuana. That's actually where I met Cosmic, and I was in the moderator chat, and this is the topic that was always coming up. They would say, well, this room is too big, so that can't be craft because he's got over 30 lights. And, they wouldn't want to post that stuff. Or, if it was a tent garden and the guy wasn't doing a perfect job, they didn't want to post that. And, I felt like, hey, you know what? If you're growing with love, and like I said, the intention of growing the highest quality product, that your goal isn't to how do I make the most money, but if your goal is how do I grow the best weed, I like to think of that as craft. But, as we continue to have the discussion, I realize that, you know, I still don't know what craft
right, but
cannabis is.
also like with them in doing that, they're really not really helping anyone because even though that person might have the right intentions, he might be doing something wrong. And whereas someone in the group could help him to point out, hey, listen, this is what's working for me, or I see that you're doing this wrong, or whatever. And and really, you know, for when you were in those groups, and even when we were on the forums back in the day, that's what it was all about, was trying to help each other, because everyone didn't have the information that they have today. Back then, there was a few books that you were a few grow books that you were able to get maybe in some kind of underground bookstore or in the back of High Times. Then then you'd have to get those High Times mailed to your house. So it was always a big deal in trying to purchase information. And so when you're dealing with people that are all doing the same thing, and maybe people are using different methods, and really that's was really the forums kind of brought all of that together. And then it also helped shape the community, whereas someone in California can mail someone in New York a clone. In New York can send someone to someone in California. So then it also opened up this big exchange of genetics that we never saw before. Where before, like, you had to know someone, like if you didn't know those guys in Virginia, or if you didn't know who Greg was, like you never would have gotten any of those cuts or anything, because and back then it was about all about who you knew, and it was really a very small niche community where you weren't going around telling people, yeah, I'm a grower, this and that. You kept everything under wraps. So when you finally when one grower actually finally did meet another grower under the right circumstances, it was like a match made in heaven, because you had two alike minds, and they could exchange information, they could exchange genetics, and so it just opened up all of this information for everyone, and the genetics also. And so that's one thing about the American weed scene is we're very passionate. We've always been very passionate from the very beginning, and that's what it was just kind of what kind of drives us. I think and it sets us apart from people in Amsterdam and people in Spain and people anywhere. Because now we're the weed mecca of the world right now. Everyone is watching what we are doing, and so. We just got to just keep, trying to keep, moving things forward in the right way. And I think helping people and to encourage people to grow. And, like for me, I know I sell seeds. So like the home grower is my customer. That guy that wants to start something in a tent with one or two lights, and he's reading about the sour diesel, but he can't get the sour diesel clones, so he could buy my seeds and try to get a good representation of it. And so that's always been kind of like, when I was breeding, it was always about preservation for me in the beginning. Like we would get certain clones and we would lose them and then be like, oh, they're gone forever, and I'd be selling the weed. And so customers, I had direct feedback from the customer, and they'd be like, yeah, I like that Northern Lights. And I'd be like, Mike, what happened to the Northern Lights? Oh, we lost it. And I'm like, dude, like that shit was fucking, popular. And so, so when I started growing, and then started coming in contact with some of these clone-only strains, I was like, I gotta, at least try to make some kind of, cross or get some kind of representation, even if it's not an exact cross of what it is. If it's 70, 80% of what it is, that's a home run for me. So and so trying to, and so I use my experience and my taste in with the sour diesel and with the hazes. And so I try to recreate those experience for other people to try, so they can buy a pack of seeds and they can get the sour diesel, or they can get the piff, or they can get the chem, or whatever. So that's really, what's really been, my main focus in breeding. And, it's always been trying to move, and also trying to move the gene pool forward as we go along. We just want the gene pool to get better and better. And we've in looking back, 30 years of smoking, 30, 40 years of smoking weed, I can say that we've really moved things forward. When I first smoked that first joint in 1979 of some Mexican or some Colombian crap or whatever, where that doesn't even exist anymore. You don't see those Mexi mids or Jamaicans or any of that imports anymore. Actually, now from what I hear, we export, where people in California are exporting to the UK, to Thailand, to Europe. Like people want to try the runs. They want to try the sherbets and all of these other all these strains that they see and read about on the internet. And that's why the internet is a very powerful tool in communication. Because you could put up and I could just speak from my own experience. You put up a dank picture or something of a plant that someone grew from your seeds, and like, yo, that looks dank. I want to get some of that. And so it's very powerful. The internet.
For sure.
Speaking of
Man,
which,
I
where can we
can.
find your seeds now?
Um, I pretty much sell my seeds wholesale to many different people that sell on Instagram. They also have websites and stuff like that. I couldn't really name all of them, but I also sell seeds direct from me to the customer. If you email me at topdogseeds@protonmail.com, you email me, I'll send you a list, and you can pick out what you want, and we can move forward if you want. I haven't really set up any kind of a legal website or anything like that, uh, just because of processing problems and pretty much payment stuff like that is, you know,
And Top Dog is TOPDAWG,
correct, correct.
right? So
Yes,
he doesn't call it Top Dog DOG. It's DAWG.
yeah, it's
So, and to be honest with you, or not, I'm always honest, but I've been looking at your posts and stuff, and the sour, is it the ones that I'm seeing photos of? Are those F5 or F6?
most of them are F5s. I think there are a few F6s that are out there now. So when I started the sour project, I pretty much, had the original sour clone that we had from AJ back from the, late 90s, early 2000s. So I had that, and I crossed it with the Tray Dog, and the Tray Dog was Afghan Chem D, and then back crossed two more times to the Chem D. So when I made that male, I kind of was trying to uh, duplicate the Chem D, which I never did. I had gotten some chemi.
I did the same thing with the Chem Dog
Yeah,
and never got it
I
to
was
be the
really looking
same.
for that garlic onion chem, and I really more or less got kind of like a chemi Afghani kind of, so I wasn't really particularly happy with the overall results of that. But when I made that, I made it for also to try to make the best male, like the strongest weed and the best male. So that was kind of my starting point, So I just decided to make that an outcross male. So so that plant kind of grew kind of short, stocky, kind of Afghan, kind of Chem D structure. And so I crossed that to the sour diesel, which was tall, stretchy, kind of almost a different, opposite growth structure. And so, I back crossed it three times, and trying to get in as much of the sour genetics as possible. And so then from the back cross three, that's when I started, you know, doing the F2s to F3s. And so when I was making my selection throughout the whole process, it was kind of easy because I was always looking for the taller, stretchier plants that were more kind of sour diesel in structure, where where I would get some that were shorter and some are kind of medium, bushier type of plants. So the sour diesel has a very unique growth structure and it's very distinguishable. So that's how I would, make my selections as I went along. And so, I would get a female and I would try to get the growth and the smell, and then I would just try to find a male that had the same structure. And obviously, like, you really can't test that male out until you grow the plants out. And so you just really got to make a conscious decision on selection and just move forward, and just trying to keep it going, and keep inbreeding as you go along until you find exactly what you're looking for. And so in the early ones, we were getting like a lot of shorter, bushier plants. I mean, they did have the sour profiles, the smell to them, but I was really looking for the structure more. And so I've really bred it back to the F6s now, and they're pretty much coming out you know, pretty stable, pretty in structure, where not everyone, but they're all pretty much alike. You might get a few that are kind of still on the shorter, squatter side, but um, I'm just really trying to get everything to where it's all kind of like the same. And so it's getting a lot closer now. And so I just kind of like held back now. I've done the F6. I just did a remake of the F6. And so I've got a couple selections now that I've kind of have out that I want to kind of just grow out, and see, how good they are, and maybe get them into production, and, see exactly, how it turns out. But it's funny how, And everyone is like, oh, where's the sour? What happened to it? It's not around anymore. And like I was saying before, there was only one cut in the very beginning. And so really, as those cuts spread out, I think what happens is, the the plant is going to adapt to the different conditions. So if you're running your room with organics and soil, and I'm running mine with hydroponics and salts, and my grow's it's got PM, it's got mites, it's got this, it's got that. You know, I think over a period of time, my sour is going to be different than your sour. And so I think a lot of the
Excuse me.
sours, at this point, the sour is like what, like the 30, close to 30 years old now, 25 years old. No, no, I guess 95, 90, yeah, you could say 95. So it's like 30 years, I mean? So any plant that's been passed around for 30 years is going to be, the genetic drift or whatever.
Epigenetic changes.
Yeah, due to, environment, to pests, for fertilizers, to light, to everything, and I think that's why they call it weed, because it's adaptable. It doesn't just stay the same. And I think it's kind of been proven, even in some plants where you can take multiple clones off of one plant and have three different plants from the same plant. So that in itself kind of tells you the genetic diversity that's in one plant. If you get three different phenotypes off of three different cuttings off of one plant, so all of that, I think, over time makes the plant change. And so I think really what people are kind of looking for is really that sour diesel woof, if you want to call it that, when you open the bag and you just kind of get woofed by the smell of it. And back in the day, it was very distinguishable of the way that it smelled and everything. And so I think,
The smell and the taste.
yeah, and I think it's kind of lost some of that over time. And I could just tell you from my experience from other plants that we've had for a long period of time that eventually they do go bad. Even like that's what happened to the underdog, the original underdog that Mike Klopp made. Like originally that just kind of crapped out. Now looking back, did it have some kind of virus or something? Something could have been going on with it, but something definitely made it degrade in quality to the point where we just let it go. And I think the same thing happened with the super skunk. Like the super skunk, like listen, everyone says, there's different stories on it, and the one that Greg got was the one that you gave him, and it was the one that Mike had, and it was the one that kind of got passed around in the Massachusetts, New England area. And from what I remember it being like, it was super, like when you open that jar, you just got like, you got that super skunk woof. But the bud itself wasn't super strong. It was kind of light, it didn't get you super high or whatever. It was
Not like the 91.
no, not at all. It was Bud Light, so uh, everyone's kind of chasing the roadkill skunk now. They're chasing the sour diesel, and I don't know. Like with the roadkill skunk, maybe there is someone out there that's got something. But to me, all of that kind of points back to Afghan genetics. So if you really want to really start from the beginning, I think that's where the original skunks come from. Afghans. It's kind of been documented, through the years, through different people that have written books, so on and so forth. Um, and so I think that the thios and all of that stuff, I think they eventually kind of change over time, and depending on your fertilizers and everything, and now with lights changing, and we kind of have what we have, and there's always that chance of someone finding a needle in the haystack. And but you just got to keep looking, and you got to keep trying. And I've always, tried to do these small kind of little hunts of stuff, that's land race or, and a lot of that stuff is just for, my own, personal, what I want to do, and there's, some Thai stuff that I remember from back in the day that I would like to get back and stuff. So there's a lot of things that we've experienced as smokers that we'd like to, recreate or we'd like to experience again. And so I think that's part of like chasing the nostalgia of certain strains or whatever, and is just trying to recreate some of that. But a lot of that stuff, when we first experienced, I think like the overall tolerance that everyone has to weed now is so much more. Because back in the day, like during the '90s, there were droughts. You remember have you ever been in a drought where you couldn't find weed? Like I've been in through many, and the last one I remember being in like 1990 in the early '90s where there was just no weed to be found in the city or anywhere else. And so, so overall, if you going through a drought and you haven't smoked for a few days or a week or however how long it may be, now you smoke something like the Super Skunk, and on today's terms may be Bud Light, but back then you were like, wow, I'm fucking super high. So now with especially concentrates and dabs and and the THC being at the highest that it's ever been, I think overall people's tolerance are much higher, and the nostalgia that they remember as a kid or back in the day was because just because they didn't smoke anything in 2 or 3 days, and all of a sudden they smoked something and got super stoned, and that would be the case and you could smoke Mexican if you didn't smoke, and smoke for a week and get high. So,
The Jamaican weed used to be really
oh
potent,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so like, I mean, it may not have been, kind bud, but that shit would make you fall
Oh
asleep.
yeah. Well, if you got that, that chocolatey lamb's bread or lamb's breath or whatever they want to call it, man, that was the shit, because that was actually kind of like chocolate Thai kind of, and it was grown, in a different environment and came out differently, but yeah, it definitely had some really super good effects to it.
I
Well,
think
one thing I
another
But
want
factor is the novelty too. Back when you first started smoking, it wasn't a feeling that you were very used to. Because I feel like that kind of attributes to what I like to call the high school high.
Right.
Because how often do you get high like you were in high school, right?
Well, if you stop smoking for a week or a month, and if you smoke, you will get that effect again.
Well, I can actually say that the other day I got higher on weed than I've gotten in years, and it was on sour diesel. So, and I'm going to tell that story in a minute, but before I do, I just want to say, because I want to finish saying this, that I've been watching you on social media, and I've been seeing these sours, and although, you're 1,000 miles away from me, and I haven't actually gotten a chance to try that stuff, it looks like sour diesel.
It does,
Like when you
and
look at it, you're like, man,
you know,
that shit actually looks legit.
it
And
has the smell
yeah,
to it,
so
and it has the smell to it. So it's really, really trying to do a really proper hunt to find that one fucking really,
I
really
think
top
I
one,
think you
and,
did a
and
good I
really.
think you did a good
And
job.
so really, that's really what really needs to be done, where someone can really do like 100 or 200, plant hunt and really go through that. Unfortunately, like, I don't have, those means to do those type of hunts and stuff. So, just trying to really get people to and that's the other thing, like, you can make the best shit in the world if people aren't willing to do it. What is it, and so, I'm fortunate enough where people, were are buying my things, and they're reporting on it, and and after a while, things just kind of, you know the reputation and the results kind of speak for themselves. And so, you just gotta, I just gotta thank people that, that are willing, to to buy and grow my stuff, and then report on it, because a lot of this is, like I said before, like, if you can create the best thing in the world, and if it doesn't get out there, no one's going to know about it. And so, and that's part of the whole thing. And as a community, I think, sharing and trying to, try to make things better for everyone is, in the end, it helps everyone.
I wanted to tell you about the thing is here in Europe, yeah? Your seeds are considered as craft as they can be, It's like people here in Europe are actually your seeds are very rarely available, but when they are available, people buy them. And for example, in Austria, I know there is a Three Dogs clone circulating, which is really appreciated. I mean, you are very well known as a craft breeder,
No,
It's like,
I appreciate that, but even like in England, where the Stardog became, one of the most popular strains, like, I had nothing to do with that. Someone bought a pack of Stardog over there and blew it up. So, like, I can only be thankful for that. Where he blew it up, and it kind of took a life of its own, and things were that good. That's what happens. And yeah, I don't really have a main distributor in Europe, so to speak. I'm just been in touch with a couple guys in Amsterdam, and they're gonna. There's one guy in Spain actually, and then there's a guy in Amsterdam. They're gonna start carrying my seeds, but I do hopefully plan to come out to Germany for the Mary Jane event out with is in June. So yeah, just keep your eyes peeled for that. Hopefully, I'm going to make that. I've been contacted.
I will meet you there. I will
I've
meet you
been
there.
contacted by someone, and I've been invited. I haven't really gotten all the details on it yet, but I think that's definitely something that I want to be a part of, that Mary Jane and the opening of Germany.
Yeah, I'm really wanting to get over there too because I hear it's a special event.
Yeah, well, now it's pretty incredible because everything is worldwide now, and that's just a connection to the internet where we can talk to someone that's in Slovenia or anywhere around the world where they would never know who Top Dog was if it wasn't for that. And so now, like, the community is now actually now a whole world community where people in Australia and Thailand and Europe and South America, like everywhere around the world, it's really kind of hard to wrap your head around. It was never really like my intention to have this happen, or when things or organically, from the beginning, that's the way things just happen, and things take a life of its own, and you just got to kind of go with the flow and just, just try to not do something stupid.
Well, I mean, you've had a legal, you know, cannabis brand for years now. People have known Top Dog for a long time. Imagine my surprise when the Slovenian Hobbit messaged me telling me that he's been hearing about me on the internet and everything. I mean, people were talking about me on podcasts I didn't even know, and they gave me this nickname Staten Island, which, you being from New York, you
Yeah.
you can relate to how shitty of a nickname Staten
It's,
Island
it's
is.
it's gotten better. At least they've closed the dump.
Yeah, they
Okay.
closed the dump.
but
So now it's just toxic
Yeah, yeah.
underground.
But listen, back then we were doing what we had to do. You know that as well as I do. We were never like, there was never any glory that was part of this. It was always danger in my eyes. Like it, and the glory was getting paid at the end of the day and not getting arrested. So there was no like pats on the back or internet popularity or any of that kind of stuff. The you getting away with it was was your reward, and you wanted to just kind of keep it at that. Well, now everyone is, waving their flag and, want to tell their story, where before, you didn't want to, you didn't want to say anything. So, it's changed quite a bit now, and, for the better, I think, of the plant, where I think now some real research can actually get done into this, where, you're getting universities and, other establishments that are, in the research department to actually do some you know, real stuff. And and if if you're looking, just on the passing of the skunk man, but some of the research that guy, those guys were doing, were just light years ahead of everyone. It's so really, I didn't, agree with all of his actions and such, but I think that they had a way. They were so far ahead of everyone that, like, we were playing checkers and those guys were playing chess, more or less.
You know, I was going to make a podcast, another one, just on this topic of Sam and Neville. But since you mentioned it now, I can't stop myself from bringing this up. We did a podcast with DJ Short, which hasn't been released yet.
I saw the clip of that, and I was looking for it. I was like, "Where is it? Where is it?" And it's like, you guys are holding out.
No, not holding out. I'm not like that. I don't have like a Patreon yet where members get it. It's just honestly, I released a new sour myself, and it's gotten such a tremendous response that I've just been slammed. But when I released that little clip, I received some hate. And it was really the first hate that I've received on my podcast at all. Like, I've gotten nothing but positive responses from everyone. It's really been overwhelming. And when I made this podcast and I put that clip up, just trying to honor Sam, I received hate messages. And some, to be honest, were even racist. But, and I just want to say this again, because I think it's important, that I am not defending anything that Sam or Neville did. Whether they're scumbags or not doesn't change the fact that they're relevant and they've really contributed to our community. And I don't know if Sam did the things that he's been accused of. I haven't seen any, proof of it. And I don't know if, Neville was a drug addict or any of the other terrible things that they say about him. But Sam did an incredible amount of work in cannabis that probably, or surely to this day, no single person has ever done. And Neville, he made all these genetics available. Like, he was the first person to put his face out there and be like, yeah, send me money and I'll send you seeds. And so, even though I received a whole bunch of, and the hate came from people just want to choose sides. They're either on Team Sam or on Team Neville. And my guess is that probably neither of them are flawless human beings. And they, but how can you deny the tremendous, like, the work that both of these guys did, the contribution that they both made for cannabis, so.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like today where, back then, I wasn't really a part of, the 90s Amsterdam scene, but from what I've been told, it was very competitive. Sam, an American, brought over genetics, all the genetics that pretty much Amsterdam were founded on came from Sam. They might have had
It's
something,
undisputed.
yeah, so we can't really argue that. And so, the practices of some of the Dutch business guys were kind of unscrupulous, uh, and they never were really for the consumer. I mean, even up until today now, like they're very unreliable. Like, I mean, I think that overall, I mean, they were gifted all of those genetics and they screwed the whole gene pool up, pretty much. Getting away from the original the original stuff that Neville brought over there. And really, if you
You
look
mean
at,
Sam?
yeah, no, I'm sorry, Sam brought over there. And if you look at the real history of it all, like, the real heyday was really during the Neville period, and pretty much from the late 90s to the late 80s to the mid 90s, pretty much. And really, the last hurrah was kind of like the Jack Herrera. And then after that, it all kind of like went downhill. And it was just kind of like a reshuffling of all those the same genetics that, the Northern Lights, the skunk, the haze, the Afghan, etc. And they were all just kind of reshuffled. And if you kind of look at it now, it's kind of like all that history is repeating itself today, where you got haters on the internet trying to discredit. I mean, they discredit you. I mean, they're trying. Even today, last 2 days, I've gotten posts reported. They're trying to get my account deleted again. It's been deleted twice already. So you got people that make up narratives about certain people, and it's just kind of like now it's kind of like a reshuffling of all the cookies and the candy stuff and
Gelato.
gelatos, all that kind of stuff on that realm. And so it gets kind of history kind of repeating itself in a sense, where it just becomes so competitive that you just want to take down the guy that's on top, or, whoever you don't like. And in today's societies, it's so much easier to try to cancel people with, someone just reporting posts or
Yeah. My
whatever.
Instagram got taken down.
Yeah, no,
Like,
yeah,
like, the I believe that the person or one of the people that sent me the hate message, he reported my Instagram, and somehow Instagram had me back on within like 6 to 8 hours because I was in a panic. I
yeah.
couldn't believe
Well, if you
that they
appeal it,
took my shit down.
a lot of those things they find out are bogus. Like how can you
Yeah.
put uh, a sexual content on a flower picture? How can you put violence on a flower picture? And this is the kind of stuff that's getting reported and posts taken down for. So I mean, there's an algorithm. Is there anyone that's really actually looking at some of this stuff? I don't think so. Because there's millions of accounts. You know how much of how many thousands of accounts this must happen to a day. It just can't do it.
Here's what they said about me: that I was supporting a dangerous organization and individual,
Yeah, I've gotten that too.
glorifying a terrorist attack, supporting violence against a particular group of people, and supporting or promoting harmful criminal activity like human trafficking. It's like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know how, like, but because they reported me as such a ridiculous thing, Instagram was able to quickly see that wasn't the case. And, luckily they didn't fuck with me for the weed pics and,
Right, but it just shows
the
you the
female parts.
but it just shows you the power that some of these people have that are nobodies that can just sit back in their mother's basement and just troll people all day long. And there's numerous people out there that do that on a regular basis. That's their main content, is just to troll people and just to put negative energy out there. And so you just really, got to try to stay focused and don't let other people define who you are. You know who you are, and you tell people who you are, and you don't let anyone tell people who you are.
Yeah. Um, I don't want to drag on this too much, but this person said to me, "What gives you the right to mention Neville in the same breath as Sam when Sam died?" And, you know, I don't know if this person's listening or not, but I give myself the right to talk about anything that I want on our podcast, but I try to keep it positive. I don't think I've ever talked negative about anyone. Like that's not, and there's been, and this is the most negative I've ever been on our podcast, and I've had moments when I've really wanted to. Like I have this platform, and sometimes I think like, should I use this platform to out these scumbags that are out there that, because people are out there kissing ass to people that they don't know, and they're like, this person's so amazing. And it's like, okay, first of all, this person's a douchebag. And second of all, they really haven't contributed as much. And the Chem Dog, people give me so much credit for, the Chem Dog, but the way I see it is I just drove that shit across country and gave it to some friends. I didn't breed it. I didn't pop the seeds. I mean, I bred with it later on, but most people didn't get a chance to see that stuff. But, there are people that are just trying to, I don't
I
know.
know what you're saying
I
because
don't want to take, because, and I'll finish real quick because this is your show, not mine. But like I'm way more proud of this podcast that we've done in 3 months than anything that I have to do with the Chem Dog story. And when people, give me credit for the Chem Dog story and make it feel like this is my legacy, it's like, well, if that's my legacy, I'm a loser. If my legacy is I just drove this plant across country and gave it to some friends, and 30 years later that's all we can talk about. So I'm really proud of this podcast. I think in a couple of months we've done some great things. The other thing that I think is my real legacy is the garden spout, my grow shop. And I taught so many people how to grow. And I taught OG growers that were growing outdoors how to grow indoors. And so, like, those are things that I can be proud of and feel that are my legacy. But the Chem Dog, that's not my legacy, And so I just wanted to put it out there to the world so that people can get this straight.
But honestly, in your defense, I know you're the one saying this, but without you, you still played an integral role, with the Chem Dog, because
I'm
Chem Dog
part of
came
the
to
story,
California.
right, everyone has their
but it's
own.
not my
The way
legacy.
Yeah.
everyone has their own little part of it. That's the beautiful thing about it because if there wasn't if there wasn't a Mike Klopp, if there wasn't a Gabby, like everyone's got their own little. If there wasn't a Greg Chemdog, like everyone's got their own little, and that's what makes this thing so beautiful because it wasn't really intentional. It's just something that came to fruition for like you were doing what you had to do at that time to you were to better your life. And so the decisions that we made in the past, and like we doing certain things, we were doing those things to try to make ourselves better and to make things overall just easier for people like that we knew. And and just as a kind of like touching on the Neville thing, like Sam was the one that brought all those genetics over, and Neville did, like he had an eye for certain things, and like he went outside of the gene pool of what Sam had gave him, and when he got the Northern Lights, and he went to the Pacific Northwest and started collecting different strains and stuff like that. And so, yeah, a lot, there's those guys were competition back then. So, they had worked together, and it's just like today when you're working with certain people or whatever, and you're good for a while, and then you have a falling out, and a discrepancy, and then that's how all of those rumors and all that stuff start to spread and everything, and yeah, I mean,
Well, I mean, the allegations, something, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The allegations are
no, I
serious.
know, I know, and
Like I don't want to minimize
but
that
the,
there are serious allegations against both these guys. It just doesn't change that they contributed.
you're right.
And I don't mention anything about what type of people they are. Like I'm not saying Sam is a great guy, and I'm not saying Neville is a great guy. It just doesn't change that they
Right.
contributed.
And that's true. And the thing you got to remember is, since cannabis was illegal, like it brought a lot of different people into the scene, that just weren't there for the love of the plant. They were there for more of the love of the money because they had addictions or whatever case may be, you know. So it kind of changes, the whole thing when it just becomes more cutthroat in the end. That's really the bottom line is when you bring a criminal element into everything, you know, and, you can be both, you could be, contribute to the community and still kind of not be the best person in the world. And even today, there's a lot of people out there like that. They're not their interests aren't really with the community or with the plant. Is a lot of it is just kind of like financially driven and kind of self-centered. Everything about me, and eventually, that gets recognized. And if you want to have longevity in the game, you really can't, conduct yourself like that because, eventually, you're the only thing, back in the day, I like to say is the only thing that we had was our reputation on how good we were on being like, I can vouch for this guy saying he's good, and the balls to do something, the balls to set up a grow, the balls to do something illegal, to know the consequences. If you get caught, that you're probably going to go to jail. You're going to go, at the very least, you're going to get arrested, and there's a good possibility to go to jail. And so you got to know all these things going in. And you also got to know that you're not going to be dealing with the most honest people in the world if you're doing something illegal. So, the whole thing just becomes a mess after a while once, you know, things start getting, out of hand. And we're dealing with the same shit today, in my opinion, on the internet. It's just, back then people would just make up rumors to disparage other people, and it's the same thing that's going on today.
Yeah.
And to me, you got to have proof. If you're gonna call someone a rat or whatever allegations you have against them, especially if you're gonna be called a rat, like you got to come up with the proof and the paperwork and such. Like otherwise, and even today, like a lot of that back in the day, like when we were on the forums and stuff, there was much more respect. Like, if you got called out, you could easily get blackballed from the community and nobody would have nothing to do with you. And that's just not the case anymore, like those kind of people flourish, scammers, rats, known rats, should I say, that are on paper, and they're still, accepted in the community. So, the overall standard, I think, is really kind of lowered now. And really, you just got to try to, surround yourself with, a like-minded people that have the same kind of morals that you have. And really, like, a lot of the younger kids now, they just don't understand because, all the stuff that we kind of went through, the only thing that they know is legal weed and Instagram. And so, I mean, it's much more than that, when it really comes down to the substance of everything.
Are you a 91 guy or are you a Chem D guy?
I'm a Chem D guy, and that's really
I know, because like
what my focus was from the beginning with the trade dog. You know
yeah.
what I mean? So that was always been like, and the thing was, I had the D before the 91 because I got the D directly from Greg. Like in 2004, 2005, shortly after he popped and found it. And he didn't have the 91 then. And at that point, I don't think anyone had the 91 on the East Coast. I think you guys had it out west and brought it back.
Well, Klopp had it, right?
No, he he
He lost
he
it.
lost it. He went to everyone started growing that underdog, and so yeah. But then but a lot a lot of my breeding comes from my own personal tastes, like the strains and stuff. Like, you're not going to find any terpenoline in most of my stuff because I don't personally like terpenoline. So I'm not going to breed with those kind of plants. I did do a breeding with like a super silver haze, Stardog, and something like that. But it's not a particular terp that I like, and so like a lot of my breeding is based on my personal preferences, and so that's kind of like where breeding almost becomes an art. Whereas it's what my personal tastes are and my interpretation of it and such. And so, and that's where in the breeding you can kind of put that personal touch in on all of that on your selections and everything because I do all of that on my past experiences on smoking. And so like when I'm hunting for a certain type of tie or a certain type of haze or whatever it is, it's because I something that I had experienced before. I want to try to recreate that for myself and to be able to offer that for other people to experience. And so that's really, where it kind of, you almost become an artist in a sense.
I definitely think it's an art, and the best art is the art that the artist makes because he's inspired, not like, oh, I'm gonna make something that other people like. This is what's popular. You're never gonna make the best product that way. If you make something because it's what you love,
Well,
you know.
either you lead or you follow, and so there's a lot of people that just want to ride off of other people's coattails and just, and so, it is what it is. You can't really focus on that. That used to bother me in the past, but now I can't. I can't focus on that. I got to focus on moving forward and doing what I got to do and block out all of the noise around me. And it's like I try not to. I try to keep things relevant, but I don't really focus on like what other people are doing. I try to focus on what I'm doing. And if there's something I feel that something that they're doing that might fit into what I'm doing, then I'll gladly incorporate that and give them credit for it. I have no problem. I've used other people's breedings and stuff like that, and so I'm very open to uh, really, if you don't pop seeds, the next best thing is going to be found in a seed. Like it's not anything that we're holding now. So it's like you got to keep hunting, you got to keep breeding, you got to keep moving the genetic pool forward, and then try to create
While
these things.
preserving at
Exactly.
the same time, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And so,
You want to bring things forward, but you want to hold on to the past too.
right. So I
Are you
think
doing any tissue culture?
no, I've never done any of the tissue culture. No, I just do regular seeds. People are always asking me about femmes and autos and this and that. And to me, a male and female When you're looking into breeding, you're looking for hybrid vigor, meaning you're finding a plant that's better than both parents. And so when you get opposites, sometimes opposites attract. You put opposites and you put them together, and you find better things. And so genetics is it's very complicated, and sometimes it's a crapshoot, and sometimes you got to have a vision on what you want to try to create. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, like but at least you tried, and just like I was explaining with the Trey Dog, where I was trying to recreate the Chem D, it just didn't happen, But you know what, that the male that I used out of that, it became a producer in itself with, it became the foundation of my genetic library pretty much, on certain levels, So that's really what you got to really focus on. And, sometimes the glory doesn't come till 5 or 10 years after. I can release a strain and, let's just take the African haze, for instance. Like I released that, in like 2010 or somewhere in that area. And, a guy named Bronson, he bought a pack. He found this African haze number 11 up in Maine, and he blew it up, and it became like one of his, staple strains, for himself, But with him blowing himself up, he blew me up in the, so those things you can't really make happen. They just happen organically, and you just got to be thankful for it.
Yeah, for sure. Um, the Stardog, was that yours?
Yeah, the Stardog. Yeah, so that was actually
Does this look like your packaging?
no,
No?
no.
Somebody's giving me these
Yeah,
seeds.
there probably someone F2'd them or whatever, but but that was the Stardog. I took that same Trey Dog male and crossed it to Chem 4. And then I wound up giving my friend some seeds, and he was friends with High Times, and he went to High Times. He gave Kyle Cushman some seeds. He gave Andre Grossman, the photographer, some seeds, and Andre, he wound up finding the guava chem, or and then Kyle Cushman took those seeds out to California, and those guys grew them out, and then they entered the San Francisco Medical Cup in 2010 and got second place. So that really kind of put me on the map, and those guys started, uh, Leo and those guys up in Humboldt, they started growing some Stardog, and it became a production strain up in Humboldt there. So, there's another instance where someone took my strain and just blew it up, and in the meantime blew me up, and so I just got to give thanks to that.
Yeah,
You
that's
can't you
awesome.
can't make that you can't make that up, and you can't make that happen. As much as you try, you can promote and try to do as much marketing behind your stuff, and if there's no substance behind it, man, people are just going to smoke it, and then it'll just get discarded. And when something's that good, this takes a life of its own.
Well, before we go, I just want to do something that I think is funny. So we're all brothers on this show, and you're our brother too today, and always JJ. But take a look at this picture. Can you
you got
guys
you
see
got
that?
you got to move it a little bit over, other way. That's
Can, can you see
yeah,
that?
I see it. Yeah.
Man, I'd swear you and Klopp are brothers.
uh,
What do you guys think, Cosmic
Oh
and
yeah.
Sasha?
listen. That's a young Klopp and an old me.
Oh,
So.
you still look young, bro. No, you still look young. Look at me, bro.
Uh,
I gotta wear a hat to hide the glare
yeah,
from the camera.
yeah.
So, and something else I wanted to show you since I've been looking at your beautiful sour. This is the
Oh,
this
oh,
is the new clone that I got.
nice.
Did you see the video that I posted on Instagram about it?
I don't think so. No, I'm gonna have to look.
So So I have, what I've been erroneously calling the original sour because it's the cut that me and my friends have had and grown for, forever, for decades. But like we were talking about before, it's gone through epigenetic changes, and it's just not that good anymore. It's good. It's just not the same,
It's not. I know
So
what it is. It's missing that woof. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And it's like that's the first thing when I could say like some of my seeds have one of the back cross threes has the woof, but it doesn't quite have the it's not doesn't smoke quite as strong. I would say so, but in today's you know, kids now are just they don't smoke to get high really. They smoke to look cool. So they want to smoke some kind of candy strain in a blunt, and they want to smoke in a blunt and look cool all day. And it's kind of a status thing more or less. Where me, just give me, a little bud of chem and a pipe, little pipe.
the 91, not the
Yeah,
D.
and I could take two or three hits off of a little pipe, and I'll be fucking way more higher than the guy that's smoking the big fucking blunt after blunt after blunt of fucking candy. So it's all
It's
personal
funny.
preference, and what works for me doesn't work for everyone else. So I can only go by what I like, and the people that have the same taste and appeal. Those are the kind of people that become your customers that are attracted to you because they have the same the same thoughts that you have on cannabis or whatever. So we find it's funny because you watch someone on Instagram or on social media or YouTube, whatever, and you get a feel of who that person is. You know what I mean? And so their likes, their dislikes, and you kind of have a you kind of have a you build an image of who that person really is. Without really knowing them, and just like you had said before, like you're picking sides or you're liking people that you don't know. You have no idea who they are. You're only seeing little flashes of glimpses of their lives on social media, and it's really not who that person really is behind the scenes.
Well, I that's why we're doing this podcast. And that's why it's not a 10-minute podcast because we want to give our guests a chance to tell their story. And that way we can really get to know them. And yeah, so
Yeah,
yeah, that's why we're doing the show.
yeah, and it's like you'd only be judged by the people that you surround yourself with, and those are the people that who really know who you are, and that's why I was saying before, where don't let anyone tell you who you are, because you tell people who you are.
That was a great thing
Before
you
we
said.
wrap
Go ahead,
up, too.
Cosmic. I know you got something
Yeah,
you want to
sorry.
say.
JJ, I'm just a huge fan of your work. I believe I-95 is your strain as well, right?
Yeah, I personally didn't do that. Money Mike, my partner, he made that strain. He's not as active on social media. He's not on Instagram or anything like that. You may find him on Canna IC Mag, but on the forums there. But yeah, he doesn't really post too much. He's very kind of private, personal, family guy.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I love the terps that you work with, and I was just, as a fan of, the strains that you've put together, I was wondering, what are you working on right now, and what are you most excited about?
I mean, right now I'm kind of like just kind of remaking the sour. I'm doing the F6s. I'm doing a remake of the Stardog right now. The Dirty Taxis have been really well received. They're making a big impact on the concentrate game, and finding its way through the legal market, some of the facilities and stuff. So that's exciting to me. I'm been doing some haze stuff. I'm always working on the hazes, so I've really been trying to. I just did this new thing called the Disco Haze, and so it's the cough times Chem D original haze. So that's more that original haze came from the Flying Dutchman, and I believe that one's more of a Thai kind of a haze. And so the cough is the same, similar kind of a haze. So that one, yeah, that one's really good. I'm expecting that to make some waves soon. And yeah, just going through, different things. But I mean, seed wise, just doing some hunts and stuff like that. And maybe I'm really maybe gonna start maybe starting to focus on some terps a little bit more, but trying to stay within my gene pool and maybe do a little out thing, but I'm not really sure, exactly on that direction yet. But it just seems like, like I was explaining, before about the terps and everything. I think that it's so much more in today's market on the way things kind of smell, and like I said, I smelled a very, powerful sense, and it's a big determination on the quality of the flower, where people are not looking for effect as much, so you just got to kind of.
Well, it's like you said too with Instagram, everything's visual based. You know, they're looking
Yes,
at what looks the prettiest. You know, and
yes.
that's in their mind. That's what
And
sells it.
so
When
I
you know,
necessarily don't. I kind of march to the beat of my own drum, but I'm always conscious of what's going on around me and where the market is heading. And so you can't really lose sight of that, even though you want to do your own personal things and everything, and and that's good and everything. But you got to be diversified. I think in today's market, where you got to do your own thing and your own niche thing, and then you can kind of touch on some of the more popular things, and you just got to try to find a nice rounded program that's going to work for you, depending on how many lights you're running, and how I wish I could fucking run 100 lights and be doing like these big population breeding projects and pheno hunts and stuff like that, but it's just not possible, unless you're in a commercial facility and things like that. So that's not really what my main focus is, because the commercial game is just fucking, it's
Tough.
just horrible over all around, just like working in those places, and just it's just not me. I'm more happy just being kind of a small kind of a guy, and just I would love to be a legal brand and all that, but the way that you know regulations and the licensing is set up, it's just not set up for people to be profitable. And it's like, if I'm going to invest my life savings in trying to start a business, like I gotta make sure that it doesn't fail. Because at my age, there's not any going back. So I want to keep what I have, what I've worked all my life for, and I have a little piece I could work with, but like I'm not going to do it unless I know I'm going to get instant results, and the way things.
Or at least a safe
Yeah,
result.
exactly. Back in the day.
At our age, we're not taking so many
No,
risks.
but back in the day, if things were like they were back in the day, where you could fucking sell wet weed, and it didn't matter what it was. I mean, that's like a no-brainer. Like, that's what I mean. Like, I'm all in on a situation like that. But
It was a safe bet
yes,
back then.
yes, it's not a safe bet anymore.
I won't mention anyone by name, but you and I both know somebody that was at Mike's wedding that we were talking about could have been his best man if I didn't do what the priest said. And to be honest with you, he grew shit weed. Like, like it was, but he always sold it.
Yeah,
Like you were able to grow shit weed, And and by the way, if he's watching, I fucking love this guy with all my might. That's why I didn't say it. That's why I didn't mention him by name. But like, yeah, back in the day, you could grow shit weed and not cure it properly and sell it for fucking 6,000 to 10,000 a pound. You know, it was insanity. You know, so hey, I want to ask you: is this your Instagram? Can you see that? The real Top
Yeah,
Dog Seeds.
that's me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure and give everybody an opportunity to check out JJ on Instagram at the real Top Dog Seeds, and dog is DAWG. And actually, before we go, we'll keep on having more questions. But weren't you the guy that originally called the dog, that spelt it DAWG?
Yes, yes. And
Okay, so
really,
tell us about
it
that.
was the Trey dog that really, and the Star dog that really, and so I really did that just to try to set myself apart, from Greg and the original Chem Dog guy, and so I didn't really want, I'm not the one
It
that
was a sign
takes
of
credit. I
respect.
can't take credit for the chem, I can only take credit for working with the chem, and I can only be, thankful that it was passed to me and that I was able to do what I did with it, and so, I can't really take any credit for the chem or anything like that, but, I can, take credit for what I've done with working with it though. And so, I mean, when we got it, we knew it was something special, but back then, like, there was so many strains back then. We didn't really know the whole genetic pool like we know it now. And like unknowingly, like, it was the best weed that I ever got back in the day, but I'm sure that there was other weeds that were just as good, if not arguably be better that we probably lost, and so, like I said, I was just lucky to be at the right place at the right time and be able to get that strain, not knowing that it was going to be what it is today. That was just dumb luck.
For sure.
And I see on your Instagram you have a Discord. Is that a good way to, if someone wanted to put in, an order or something?
Yeah,
some of your
yeah. The
seeds
Discord is a lot more looser on the way we talk and stuff like that. And I also have another backup Instagram account, Top Dog Seeds JJNYC. So yeah, the Discord is a little bit of a more stable platform where we could actually have like conversations. People can show what they're, and really the Discord is not even really about me. It's like it's mostly about the users, and they're the ones that are posting what they're finding in Top Dog Seeds and talking about other strains that are relevant and just the cannabis community and everything. So it's really kind of set up more for the users and people that buy the seeds. And I try not to like get too involved in editing comments, good or bad. If someone pops a pack of my seeds and they're not happy, they say it's shit or whatever the case may be. Like that's their opinion. I'm not going to cherry pick comments that are good and bad to make myself look better. The proof is in the pudding. And if 10 people say it sucks, I would bet that it probably sucks. So, at the end of the day, my opinion doesn't mean nothing. Whose opinion matters are the people that are finding the results. And so if we want to be honest about and transparent about everything, and that's the way I've always been, good and bad. You're not always going to hit a home run. You're gonna get a couple ones that aren't going to make the cut or whatever, and you just got to
If you
live with
start
that.
editing out the bad comments, then people know that it's not legit, and
Right.
you don't have like, you don't want to edit out all the comments, all the bad comments.
No,
It's just,
no.
it is what
And
it
even,
is.
people can personally attack me or say whatever they want about me. Like I said, it doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, but am I going, just because they said something that I don't like, am I going to edit that out? I may argue with that person and try to, prove my point or whatever, but they have an opinion and a point also, so it doesn't mean that it's right, but we can debate that.
Yeah, but opinions could be like assholes. We all got one, and they all stink.
Yeah, no,
So
some stink more than others. So yeah, you're right about that. So, you know, to me, just trying to be transparent and honest, and you just gotta operate correctly, and everything will take its place down the road.
Well, there's a reason why you have had the longevity you've had, and I think it's because of that,
Well, people,
and
you could ask people who know me personally, and they'll tell you who I am, and those are the people who know me, and so your reputation kind of follows you, and the longer you're around, the more people can vouch for you, and it's just something that over time it just it is what it is, and so you just try to fucking stay correct, and you know and if people want to hate on you, then even the best. If you're in the public eye, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a singer, entertainer, play sports, anything, there's someone that hates you. So there's someone that don't like you for whatever reason. I don't like their song. I don't like, I don't like their team. I don't like this. I don't, So it's something that you got to live with, and if you got a thin skin and you can't take hate, and I would say, being in the public eye is probably not for you,
do
because
you think it's thin skin, or do you think that it could be caring too much what people think about you?
well,
Because
that too. I mean, I used to think
like
like
I
that.
don't think I have thin skin,
No, but it,
but I do care what people
I,
think about me.
I I do too. And back in the day, it meant something when you were on the forums. It really meant something because that's all you had was what people said about you. You know what I mean? And so you could be blackballed out of the community very easily. In today's world, it's totally different now. It's just it's like kind of anything goes. With the scammers and copycats, and just it just keeps going on and on. So you just got to kind of block all of that out, and what's true and what's not true. So if, when people are saying stuff that's not true about you, you can't let that bother you, or show that person that it bothers you, because they'll just continue on and make it worse. You know.
it feeds the trolls entertainment.
Yes, and for some people, that's what their sole mission on the internet is to do, is just to try to, ruin people, because their life is sucks themselves, so they want to make everyone as miserable as they are. So
Oh, Gabby, you're muted.
I said I really appreciate you for coming on, JJ, and we could talk for
yeah,
hours
yeah.
more, and we should do it again. I think we probably could do another show of 2.5, 3 hours, and still not scratch the surface.
Yeah, I know. There's
But
just so much. There's just so much out there now that it's.
I mean, one thing, like, I do want you to come back because I want to hear the stories about how you were busted, and you know,
Yeah, there's no
I
real
like I said,
glory behind any of that. I'll tell you
the
that.
well, it's not about glory, but it's still
Yeah, it's
look.
part. I
So
mean, it was part of our lives. It's something that we had to deal with on a
if
regular.
you want to finish what you were saying, and if you have anything you want to say about the Chem
Yeah, I
D.
mean, I mean, it is one of the best strains that that's out there in existence today. I'm sure.
Right
Yeah, that's a
after the
matter of
91.
opinion. But the thing about the '91, it doesn't have no taste to it, and I don't think it's not quite as strong. It's not
See,
quite as
that's what I
strong.
think it has. I don't
Oh,
think the
it's got the
Chem D
onion
has the
garlicky
taste.
thing going on. How can you say that?
Yeah, but I just want the 91 taste is what
Yeah,
my
that's kind of
palate
a more
really
bland. Yeah.
desires, and the Chem D, I agree that the Chem D might be more potent, but for me it's all about the
Yeah,
terps.
I don't know. To me, it's
Always
a little
has been
more
about the
blandish,
terps. And
the 91, but I still appreciate it. I love it. You know what I mean? But it's a lot harder to grow too than the Chem D. The 91 is kind of like the sour diesel. It's kind of finicky, and sometimes it can come out a little bit different
for
than
sure,
others. But like um like like we've been growing it, and it's kind of gotten like this little kind of purpley tip to it almost now in the terps that are coming out on it. Like it's kind of almost like a little purpley grapey, just a little slight tinge in there, you know. But yeah, it's funny, you know, that I think it's kind of changed over the years a little bit.
How does the four fit into this
I mean, the
equation?
four was kind of found afterwards, and so I guess that Greg had seeds. Well, I guess he had like 12 or 13 seeds originally. Then he popped, I don't know how many, maybe like half of them, or then he gave the other four seeds to Joe Brand, and he found the Chem 1, 2, 3, 4, and I wound up breeding with the Chem 4, and that was the one that was the best one out of the four. And like some people like to think that it's not the same as a Chem, you know, that it's different than the Chem 91 and Chem D, and you know, they might have an arguable point there. It's kind of hard to say, you know, because like the 1, 2, 3, 4 are very all the same, and whereas the 91 is kind of stand on its own, and the Chem D and the Chem sister were alike. So there was like almost three different phenotypes in there, and so with the last four being pop last, you know, there is some controversy of people saying that it might have been seeds of the Chem or something like that, like a cross of the Chem, should I say, and not the original Chem. But none of that can really.
I mean that story kind of checks out because you know Greg had four seeds of the original ones, and then years later more
Right,
turned
but the
up.
thing,
It's just
but they said the same
you
thing
know so
about the Chem D, and my argument is like, because he popped them in 2005 or six or whatever, in the 90. I mean the Chem D and the Chem sister are almost exactly alike, other than one being more sativa and the other one being more indica, but there's no denying that they're not sisters. Okay, so you can definitely say that they're the same, and then the 91 was in the same pop as the sister, so those two are confirmed right there. So yeah, the last four seeds that were popped that were totally different from those two, I guess you can argue that it could be that. Can we prove it? It can never be proven, you know, but I don't know. It's just one of those. Yeah, I was gonna say it's
it
just
doesn't
like
matter that
one of
much.
those things in
Yeah.
cannabis
Well,
that we'll
what
never know. We'll never know.
right? What Greg always said was you're muted, Cosmic. What
My
Greg
bad.
always said was that anything he grows is the Chem Dog
Right. Okay.
because he's Chem Dog.
Yeah.
That
If you were to rank those three, I
Right.
feel
Yeah,
like
I
you'd
would say
put Chem
Chem
D at the
D
top, right?
91, Chem 4 for me. You know,
I'm growing Chem 4 for the first time right now, so
and
I'm
Chem 4 is
excited to
kind
see
of
how it turns
funny
out.
because for me, when I grew Chem 4, it always finished like 60, 63 days. Other people are like, I take it to like 77 or something like that, you know, and so, and even my Stardog, you know, which is pretty much Chem 4, he's kind of Chem 4, Chem D, arguably, Afghan, but all of those come out finishing pretty much like the Chem 4. You know, they're all kind of short, squat, big buds, finishes in usually like 63 days and stuff. So Yeah, it's the Chem 4, the genetics are pretty dominant on it, and it kind of has that piney kind of little bit of fruitiness to it, depending on the phenotype. And if it leans more Chem D, which kind of like the Corey Stardog does, and or the Guava, which is more Chem 4. So that was kind of the differences in that cross there.
Nice.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I love all those strains, so it's so cool to hear the history, right from you.
Well, like I said, JJ, we got to
Yeah,
have you come back
anytime.
on because we got way more stories to tell. So
Yeah,
just let us know
yeah.
when's good for
You
you,
know,
and
you
and,
know.
and we'll get you back on. And I really appreciate you spending 3 hours of your day with
Yeah, I
us
would like to
today.
get
And
on. It'd be
and
nice to
it's
get
good
on with
catching up
like
again.
Klopp or something, and get, Klopp,
Let's do it.
AJ, try
Let's
to
do it.
get,
Let's get
kind of a group thing of the
yeah.
people that were there back in the day. If we can get, Vondo or Maxwell and try to get, some of this, the sour kind of sorted out.
A
Yeah.
sour diesel roundtable. Yeah, I
Oh
just
man,
don't
that'd be
qualify to
cool.
be there, except maybe as a guest. But yeah, I know that Mike will do a video with you. I actually thought about having him come on to do this one, but I just kind of wanted to do one with you first. But Mike will do it for sure, and then we can call these. I don't talk with AJ very
Yeah,
much. I
he
do
would
have
be
his
up to it.
number, but
I
I
got
could
his
ask him if he
number.
wants to
I'm
do it.
in, usual contact with him.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do a sour diesel roundtable real soon. And until then, I hope you have
Yeah, you too. I
a
appreciate you
great
having me
day
on and everything.
and everything's going good for you. Oh, and I'm sure I had the most fun of anyone here.
Okay. Take care, guys.
Thanks, buddy.